Hi, everyone. You're all welcome back. It's a great pleasure having you with us once again. This event is hosted by Richflood, a leading continental provider of environmental and social due diligence services for investment in Africa. According to research, emergencies can occur in our day-to-day life, potentially from both natural disasters and human-related activities. Therefore, the ability to identify hazards and subsequently evaluate the risk plays a pivotal role in the preparation of emergency response plans as well as their resilience. So the topic for discussion today is emergency response preparedness and resilience. And this workshop will help address the importance of proper hazard identification and risk evaluations, both natural and industrial. Elements to make an emergency response plan resilient, as well as the relationship between governments, organizations, and communities for the improvement of emergency response plan. In the morning session, we had Mr. Peter Agabwe and Mr. Ken Heap, who shed light on the topic of discussion. Mr. Peter, in his discussion on hazard identification and risk assessment, explained that hazard is part of the process being used to evaluate if any particular situation, item, or thing may have potential to cause harm. And the goal of hazard identification is to find and record possible hazard and how hazards can be identified through observation, use of materials, safety data sheet, hazards and risk survey, and the likes. Also, Mr. Ken Heap, in his discussion, made us to understand that the objective of emergency response is to keep people safe, protect the environment, as well as protect the assets, and of course, having a good reputation. He also talked about the organizational structure that we need to have, and especially emphasizing on the fact that in an organization, someone needs to be trained in emergency response, and also the capacity to manage the organization's records needs to be provided for the person in order for such a person to meet up with a timeline immediately an hazard occurs. He went further to tell us about the management involvement in hazard identification and risk assessment, especially in an organization. Just in case you missed the morning session, the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel. Now, this afternoon session will last for 1 hour. Let me quickly go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. This workshop will be recorded and made available on Richflood's YouTube channel. And all participants are in listen-only mode. Therefore, we implore you that you rename yourself and add your organization after your name in brackets so that you can be properly identified. Also, poll questions will be utilized during the course of this workshop, and we would appreciate your active participation. Let me also inform us all that we will all have opportunity to send in questions at any time during the presentation, and our speakers will address them during the question and answer session at the end of all the presentations. And to send in your questions, kindly utilize the chat box, which is located at the bottom of your screen on a laptop and at the top on a tablet. And please include your name and location while sending in your comments and questions. During this afternoon session, we have our presenters being Mr. Ken Heap, Mr. Inya Emmanuel, and the team from National Oil Spill Detection and Response Agency, NOSRA. I would like to introduce the first presenter for this session in person of Mr. Ken Heap. He is an accomplished, results-driven postgraduate HSEQ professional with over 25 years experience working with both local and global operators in senior consultancy roles on international oil and gas exploration and production. He is highly experienced in the management of world-class health, safety, and environmental management systems at all stages of the value chain, from licensing and planning through implementation to final remediation. He is also a chartered environmentalist and registered lead author of ISO 14001-2015 and other relevant standards like ISO 45001. You're welcome, Mr. Heap. Also, we have Mr. Inya Emmanuel, who is a fire officer of the Nigerian Federal Fire Service with 20 years of experience and interest in early warning systems. The Federal Fire Service has the statutory responsibility for rescue, fire prevention, mitigation, firefighting, as well as paramedical and other information services. You are welcome, Mr. Emmanuel. Together, we're also going to have in our midst today the NOSRIA team, comprising of 3 personnel from National Oil Spill Detection and Response Agency, to be led by Mr. David Astrop, who is an environmental scientist working with NOSRIA. He has a lot of technical skill, including aerial photography and satellite remote sensing applications. He has participated in a lot of remediation activities at NOSRIA. He has lots of publications to his credit, and his other team members who will be contributing to the topic under discuss is Mrs. Ajayi, who is the Assistant Director at NOSRIA, and then we have Awele Oshafina, who is also an environmental scientist at NOSRIA. Right now, I will invite Mr. Ken Heap for his presentation. Over to you, Mr. Ken. The floor is yours. Mr. Ken,
okay.
So that we can hear you.
Thank you, Adiola, for that introduction. I take it you can hear me now, yes? Right, I'm going to keep my presentation or comments very short.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
I'm going to keep them very short because for 2 reasons. First of all, I made some points this morning. And the second thing is we clearly have some very able and highly experienced professionals to hear from this afternoon. So I'm going to keep mine to a very short few comments, and hopefully I can contribute to the question and answer session later. All I would like to do is reiterate something I wanted to be very clear on this morning. One of the things I've noticed in helping a lot of large and small organizations with their emergency response is that a lot of people fail to realize that the roles and responsibilities during emergencies often have to be redefined. They may not reflect the organization during the normal running of the business. And the reason for that is we have something called a crisis. A crisis is something where the organization has to deal with external stakeholders to protect its reputation and deal with its legal matters, for example. So during a major emergency, many organizations will be asked to deal with senior government officials, relatives, press, all these people external to the organization will, as soon as the information about an incident becomes out there, they will besiege or they can besiege if they're not managed, the organization. And many of these stakeholders who come to the organization for information are very senior people, senior government ministers, etc. And it makes sense that the top management should reserve themselves during even a very serious incident to managing that crisis. And a crisis doesn't need to have an emergency. You can have some crisis because of something that happens which is nothing to do with an accident or an incident in the office. It can be something that's happening in the outside world. But if there is a major emergency in the office to do with the business, then senior management should really reserve themselves for the crisis. This is just good practice because it allows the people in middle management and the people who actually run operations at the sharp end of the business to be organized in such a way that they can manage the actual emergency. I'm sure the fire service will be able to comment more than me on how at the site of the emergency, we have a highly trained specialist who deals with the actual front line, the sharp end of the fire or the rescue, and they take the decisions because they've got their eyes on the situation. They deploy the local resources and they call back to another group who are providing them with any extra resources they need and information. So it's very important to understand that organization during an incident may not follow the usual reporting lines and usual seniority. Crisis, you must understand, is about reporting to the outside. Actually, managing the emergency is about making sure the organization can look after the health and safety of people, manage its environmental assets, and deal with its reputation, manage its assets and deal with its reputation in that order usually. But that's the key, that senior managers should keep themselves available to deal with external stakeholders, because I've seen it happen that a senior manager suddenly rushes off to the site, they're not trained, starts managing an incident, and then is called back to the office because some senior minister wants to talk to them. It becomes a joke. So we have to organize into a crisis team and an emergency response team. And I'm sure the fire and rescue professionals can explain how that's organized. So that's all I really wanted to say, because I really want to hear from, and I'm sure everybody else wants to hear from, the fire service and the national response team. Obviously, I'd be very happy to take any questions at the end. Is that okay, Adiola? I'm very aware that we haven't got much time, and I just want to make that one point, because you can't say everything. There's so much I'd like to say. One point: organize into crisis team, support team, and front line. Depending on the complexity of your organization, that could be one or two people. It could be quite a big team. That's me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kemp. That was brief but concise.
Wow.
Thank you.
I'm just thinking of time, Adiola. There's lots more I could say, but I think we've got such eloquent, such experienced speakers on. I said stuff this morning. Everybody wants to hear from them.
Yes, I understand. There's no problem. Thank you for being considerate.
I'll be very happy to take any questions to me at the end.
Yes, of course. At the end of all the contributions, we are going to take the questions and direct them to the respective speaker.
Yeah.
Okay, so right now I would like Mr. Emmanuel to come up for his presentation. Let's have your contribution, sir. Mr. Emmanuel, over to you.
Thank you, Adiola. It's indeed my pleasure to be here with you guys. And I was actually feeling happy when Mr. Ken was making his earlier comments. And I just want to let him know that in the fire department, it's a bit different from the regular corporate organizations in the sense that, upon recruitment into the fire department, you are recruited as a fireman, irrespective of your course of study in the university, as the case may be. So you go through the rudimentary training as a fireman. That gives you that strength when you grow to the managerial level to actually respond to incidents, as a manager. So our fire department is a bit different to managing crises and then managing disasters. However, if we look at the topic of this discussion this afternoon, it's actually quite interesting. And I usually ask, why do we need to have or to be aware or to know or put processes in place, against any objects or activities that may potentially cause injuries, loss of lives, destruction to property and environment? Why do we need to do all this? Now, the simple answer we can easily place our hands on is when each time you witness emergencies or disasters, you can easily say, oh, there's a need to have an emergency response plan. There's a need to have emergency preparedness plan. There's also a need for these plans to be resilient. And for every time there's an emergency, we have billions and millions of naira lives being lost. And for each victim of these emergencies or disaster, they are further pushed down, deep into vulnerability because of the economic losses they have suffered from this disaster. So looking at for me, I believe that this subject matter is, very apt. If you look at the recent fire incident in Abuja in a supermarket, you can agree with me that this subject of discussion is actually apt. And if you look at the subject of discussion and try to relate it with the emergency management cycle, you only discover that we're only dealing with two aspects of the emergency management cycle. Of course, the emergency management cycle comprises of the preparedness, the response, the recovery, and mitigation. So if we are talking about emergency response, preparedness, and resilience, we are basically talking about the two phases in emergency management cycle. So as a background to, reference to the background Diola made, we'll be looking at our contribution on these three segments of importance of proper hazard identification and risk evaluation, both for natural and man-induced, element of emergency response plan resilience, and also the relationship between government, communities for the improvement of emergency response plan. So I do know that the earlier speakers in the morning may have given some definitions, but for us to properly, put into context our subject of discussion this afternoon, especially for the afternoon session participants, it may be important for us to also look again at these definitions and understand what the content of this subject matter is properly. So I always like to borrow this definition from the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience that describe emergencies as an event, actual or imminent, that endangers or threatens to endanger life, property, or the environment, requiring a significant and coordinated response. So if we look at that definition, you agree that, yes, emergency is not only when incident happens. So even when there is a threat, we can also consider it as an emergency. And I'll give you an instance. I have responded to several calls where a passenger, an occupant of a lift in a multi-story building is trapped. He's stuck in that lift, and we are called upon. At that point, it's only being threatened. So, but we are called upon as an emergency responder, so you respond to such incidences. So I always like to take this definition from Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience. Now, when we talk about response, what is actually response? We can say that response is an action taken directly before, during, or after an emergency. So when there's an emergency, there's always an action that is taken. And that action is taken towards a particular objective. So in planning response, it is important to be prepared by way of knowledge and capacity development, either by government, response and recovery organizations, communities, or individuals to effectively, anticipate and respond to and recover from impacts of likely, imminent, or current emergencies. So for us to be prepared, these are the things we need to do. So there must be some level of knowledge development to be able to, handle or manage emergencies. And preparedness is usually based on, proper or sound risk assessment, and the linkages between the early warning system and those identified hazards is also part of the preparedness plan. So for emergency response and preparedness to be resilient, then it must have the capacity to be able to resist, absorb, or accommodate the victims or the exposure to hazard. What am I trying to say here? What I'm trying to say here is that for a disaster or emergency response plan to be resilient, it must be able to, resist exposure to hazard. It must be able to provide that mechanism to recover. And this whole process must be timely and efficient so that we'll be able to preserve and restore the basic structure and functioning of that system that have been exposed to that hazard. So that is what we look at in emergency preparedness plan. Now, I also want to look at the core areas now, going down to the core areas we're looking at, which is number one, the importance of proper hazard identification and risk evaluation for both natural and man-made emergencies. If we don't understand what hazard is, it will, of course, be difficult for us to understand how to identify them. So if we look at hazard from the definition of a United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, that says that hazard is a process, a phenomenon, or human activities that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, social or economic destruction or environmental degradation. So you can see that what constitutes hazard comes in different forms. It has different effects on different, systems or a community. So when you look at hazard, there are 3 categories of hazard, actually 2, but the UNDRL, came up with a 3rd one, known as a Socio Anthropogenic disaster hazard. So we have the natural hazard, we have the human or man-induced hazard known as the anthropogenic hazard. Then we have the socio-natural hazard. These are hazards that has, is associated with human activities like environmental degradation and climate change. So for me, my contribution will be tailored a bit towards fire. So if we look at the things that constitute fire hazard, they are all the factors that can cause ignition, that's starting fire, those that can aggravate fire severity, those that, that will accelerate, like we said, aggravate or accelerate the severity of the fire. And then we also look at the evaluating the risk, what is involved in risk evaluation is also part of the whole process of when you identify a hazard, you should be able to tell the level of risk this hazard poses to the system, the office, the building, or the community. Now, for proper hazard identification and evaluation of risks, it becomes important in emergency management because one, proper hazard identification will help us to identify means of dictation and early warning system. So if we identify that there's a high risk of this particular hazard in this area, then we should be able to come up with the means of dictating the occurrence of an emergency by way of an early warning system and the type of dictation and early warning system that will be suitable for that particular hazard. Then proper hazard identification will also help us in controlling the spread of fire. Now, for instance, the recent fire incident I referred to earlier on in the supermarket, preliminary investigations show that there were a lot of breaches to fire safety provisions, ranging from poor housekeeping to lack of preparedness, and maybe partially fit emergency plan. And of course, the emergency plan is not just about providing the fire dictating devices or firefighting devices. It starts from the design stage of the facility. So the facility probably was not even designed for the purpose for which it was used. So those are the conditions that we accelerate any emergency when they occur. And that was why we saw the a very high level of damage to that supermarket in that recent fire incident. Of course, proper hazard identification will help us in determining the proper route of escape in a building. We should be able to know when we carry out our risk assessment, whether the number of exits are adequate for the size of occupant in a particular building, whether the means of exit have been properly identified to aid evacuation during emergencies. It is proper hazard identification that will be able to give us that insight to be able to say, okay, there are no adequate means of exit in this building, or there are adequate means of exit, but they are not properly labeled to guide people during an emergency. Take, for instance, if you do not have an exit sign that are illuminated when there is darkness, it becomes difficult for people to ordinarily evacuate, a building smoothly following the directional signs, because the directional signs are not properly illuminated for them to be visible during emergencies. And because of that state of chaos, it becomes much more difficult for even the rescuers to be able to make use of the access routes effectively to rescue victims. Then identifying proper hazard identification and risk evaluation will also help us in identifying firefighting provisions necessary for that facility. Of course, if you have a facility that is dealing with a highly flammable material, the type of provision required for such places is not the same as a school, a facility used for educational purposes. So the type of activity being carried out in a particular facility, is what determines the type of firefighting provisions that should be made in such facility. And it's only when you carry out a proper hazard identification and risk evaluation that will be able to determine all that. Now, having an emergency evacuation plan is also a consequence of a proper hazard identification and risk evaluation. If you carry out a proper hazard identification, that gives you, the room to be able to come up with a risk, with emergency evacuation plan that we enable occupants of those that facility to be able to make use of this plan during emergencies. And that plan also helps the emergency responders to also manage the evacuation of occupants of that facility during emergencies. And then also, when we carry out proper hazard identification, we will be able to identify vulnerable people, in a facility. Most of the challenges we face in Nigeria is that building designers only design for able-bodied persons, making it difficult for people who are physically challenged or differently able to effectively evacuate a structure when there's an emergency. So that is what we have been preaching and putting effort in place to make sure that for every structure, there's a provision for fully able people to evacuate or assess, as well as differently able people or physically challenged persons to assess and evacuate during emergencies. Now, if we look at the element of emergency response plan resilience, it's important also to look at what a plan is, an emergency response plan, what it is. I would say, and the purpose of emergency response plan is to address emergencies that may occur. Transferring emergency response plan, when we have put a plan in place, the whole purpose is to address emergencies that may occur. And because we have an emergency response plan, we have an emergency preparedness plan. During emergencies, we are transiting from emergency response plan to emergency preparedness plan. And what are these plans? Basically, when you have an emergency response plan, that plan enables you to properly identify the hazard and risk, put the necessary measures in place to mitigate them. Now, when you have an emergency preparedness plan, it has to do with the knowledge and capacity of the persons who uses those facilities to be able to make use of those emergency response plans put in place. For instance, you may have trained a certain group of employees of that facility to be able to make use of the fire extinguishers, the smoke detectors, and you must have sensitized the occupants to be able to differentiate between an alarm coming from a smoke detector and maybe a regular siren of the ambulance or the fire response vehicles. So when we were able to train persons to gain knowledge or have the required knowledge and capacity to deal with emergencies, we are putting emergency preparedness in place. And of course, it must be documented so that occupants will be able to know, in the event of an emergency, Mr. A is going to do X, Y, Z. Mr. B is going to do A, B, C. As an occupant, this is what you are expected to do. You are expected to exit through this particular direction to get to an assembly point. So the plan is just a document, and that document, like we say, it must be a living document because it's updatable, and we can always, change it from time to time as situation changes as well. So in emergency response plan, we are looking at the document which is written. So the persons who are charged with the responsibility of managing, emergencies, like the HSE managers, who must always have this document. The personnel who have been trained to be able to make use of fire extinguishers must know where fire extinguishers are located, the type of fire extinguishers they have in place, and what kind of fires, for instance, each fire extinguisher is to be used for. So an emergency response plan, we have a written document. It must contain the procedures for reporting emergencies. So if you have an emergency response, a fire incident in the building, how do you report that fire incident without, causing chaos that will lead to stampede. So instead of reporting an emergency, you have ended up creating more emergencies. Then emergency response plan will also have map of that infrastructure. The map of a building also help emergency responders when they are responding to a particular place to be able to manage response effectively. So emergency response plan should have the map of that facility. An emergency response plan should also contain procedures for, like I said, it should also contain procedure for reporting emergency. Then emergency response plan should also have the meaning of colors and code signs. Now, what do we mean by colors? We use colors to identify or differentiate different facilities. Take, for instance, you have run a surface piping along the staircase. Now, that surface piping will be colored differently based on the content of those pipes. So the color coding should also be part of the document, so that persons who are using that facility or the persons who have been trained to manage emergencies in that building or facility will be able to identify them properly. Then we also have to train persons to be able to manage emergencies in that building, and of course, assign responsibilities. So, which is a critical part. You must know who is doing what at what time. Then the relationship between, while I'm rounding up, I'll just quickly touch this part. The relationship between government, organizations, communities for the improvement of emergencies is usually the relationship between, the government makes the rules or the policies or the regulation, the communities, the organizations are expected to comply with that. And we have seen that as a major challenge to emergency management in Nigeria. For instance, government make regulations, expect the citizens, the organizations to comply with it. The organizations don't comply with those regulations that have been made by government. And because there's weak or inadequate enforcement, this leaves room for the communities to, carry out sharp safety practices that always escalate emergencies when they occur. So the relationship between government, the community, and organizations is a relationship of government makes the rules, the regulation, and enforces them. Whether government enforces or not, it's expected that the individuals, the organization, the community comply with those regulations that government have provided. So basically, this is what I have to contribute to this subject matter. And I'll be standing by for any question or comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Emmanuel. That was insightful and quite enlightening and highly informative. Thank you very much. Quickly, we'll go over to, after the third presenter, we would attend to all the questions. I've been receiving lots of questions. Let's keep it coming. Thanks for your active participation so far. At the end of the presentation by the NOSDRA team, we are going to attend to all the questions and answers. So right now, I would hand over to Mr. David Astrop. Okay, Mr. David. Yes, please, you can speak now. Okay, I can't hear you, Mr. David. I don't know if you can hear me. Mr. David Astrop or the NOSDRA team. The NOSDRA team, please, over to you. Okay, Mr. David, we can't have an audio from your end, but I know you have other people who are on your team and you are there together. If you can switch to their own network, I think that would be nice so that we can hear you through any of their devices.
Hello.
Okay, finally you are in. Hello, Mr. David.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, good. I want to say a very big thank you to you, Adela, for having us on this program. And also, so the other contributors, they have made so much of impact to the topic emergency response preparedness. But I was waiting to see what emergency response preparedness implies. I have not seen as an explanation or as a discussion. I will just pick mine from there. A lot has been said, and let me say that emergency response preparedness is simply the intended response to an unexpected, serious, and dangerous occurrence. Now, if you look at that definition, I'm trying to share my screen. If you look at that definition, simply the intended response to an unexpected, serious, and dangerous occurrence. Now, it implies that these are things that we are not prepared for. These are things you do not know the hour or the time they will occur. And therefore, it is of importance to have a preparedness to combat such scenario as the case may be. So the preparedness here is simply an unexpected, serious, and dangerous occurrence that could occur from any organization, from any forms of work at all. Now, I would say the emergency planning may involve preparation and planning for natural disaster or man-made disaster. This simply means that there are two types of accidents or disaster. It could be man-made, it could also be natural disaster. Now, there is need for us to have a response to combat any of these that may occur, depending on the nature of what we do. For me, as an environmental scientist, I would want to say something briefly on the environment. For example, over the years, there have been climate change that has affected a lot of things, affected food, affected crops, and all of that, you know. But if you look at the situation in Africa, for example, there are no response preparedness in place to handle some of these things. Now you see that some of the farmers get so confused of what to do. Probably a number of them are not educated. So the emergency planning may involve preparation and planning for natural disaster or man-made disaster, accident. It could be breach of security, medicals, food, product, and all of that. Now, all of these things we are talking about now are simply, we are saying they are unexpected, they are unserious, they are dangerous and all that. We could refer to them as accidents. We could refer to those things an accident. Then it boils down to what are the causes of these accidents that we talk about. We should look at the causes. For example, if there's a problem, there is need to start from the cause of these problems. Here, I'm going to be discussing the causes of accident. Yeah, I say this accident here, it could be due to leads of equipment failure. It refers to any event in which an equipment cannot accomplish an intended task. You understand? We have this happen many times. I can cite many examples, but because of my time frame, I'll try to limit my scope to just this equipment failure and other few things I may want to mention. The equipment failure is there. The improper operation is there. Failure in performance of preventive maintenance, failure in continuous monitoring. If you observe, these things are actually the cause of accident. In this type of the part of the world where we are, we know how often we carry out maintenance on equipment. And we have a scenario where, for example, a fire incident occur, and you're going to pick a bigger fire extinguisher to actually combat the fire. That extinguisher, you have not checked if it was working in the last 1 year. So the maintenance culture is not there for Africa, for example. And some of these things leads to equipment failure. It is not until there's a problem before we start finding solutions. Solutions should be on ground to combat issues that may arise in the future. Okay, I talk about failure in continuous monitoring. We don't check those things to actually ensure that they are in place. And we look at types of this failure. We have the intermittent failure. These things start failing. Note that some of the equipment, some of our response equipment, for example, start failing over time. We keep managing those things. We keep managing them. We are aware that these things are having issues, but over time we keep managing them, and it goes into a gradual failure. You understand? Intermittent failure simply means a failure could occur of an equipment at a time. You could be using that same equipment again for a long time, and there will not be anything such as that of failure. Okay, now then it leads to a gradual failure. It leads to a gradual failure. At sometimes you try it and it will not work. So we have there's also the operator failure. There are times to carry out checks on this equipment and all that, depending on whatever equipment you're using. I just cited fire. Also, I will mention some other ones. And also in Africa, we forget what is called the physical wear and tear. Over time, there are specifications for certain things to work. After this time, they may not be functional, but we don't look at those things. We just see those things as, okay, this should just work. This should work. And when there's an emergency, we bring out those things, and those things will fail because they've served the time of the physical wear and tear. There's also a testing problem. It is not when there is an issue we now be running around. There is need for us to have the equipment tested over time. There should be a periodical evaluation of those equipment and their functionalities. And I'll say response preparedness is for us as environmental scientists. For example, when you mention NOSDRA, we play key role in remediations, oil spill, and all that. So for NOSDRA, for example, we play the safety aspect, we remediate, and we respond. But I would like to say that if there are, in every organization, we'll discuss briefly on the safety aspect. We should have an alarm to raise. We should also be in good relationship with persons, organizations who can be of help, especially when your emergency overpowers what you the situation on ground. There should be a call for alarm, like having stakeholders that can actually respond to you to time. Both private and public sector will be of importance. Also, we should have an alarm. We should have an exit doors to every organization, such that they will try to avoid stampede and all that in any case of an emergency. Okay, so I'll just speak briefly on the role of safety. What we do in safety, we try to ensure that the spill of oil, for example, does not exceed, we try to curtail spill generally. If there's a spill, I'm just using that as an example. If there's a spill of a crude on waterways, we try to curtail the spill. You see that we may not be the one to do it immediately. Whoever is the company is carrying out these procedures. They are carrying out these procedures, trying to curtail the spill. But when it exceeds their own response capacity, there is need for them to seek for stakeholder support as well as external support. So I will say that for preparedness, a lot needs to be in place. We should not wait for things to happen before we respond to them. There are a lot of hazards in workplace, in different places. I could just mention some of them because of my time. I have physical hazard here, which affect workers in extreme weather conditions or harmful environment. Workers are exposed to any form of danger, physical or mentally. For example, COVID-19 is an example of a physical hazard. You're treating somebody for either malaria and the person is actually already infected with COVID. Of course, the person who is carrying out the treatment also gets infected through conversation. So it's an example of a physical kind of hazard. We also have safety hazard, which is an unsafe working environment or condition that could cause injury, illness, and death. You understand? I may not have the luxury of time to give example of some of these things. We also have the biological hazard, oftentimes referred to as biohazard, in form of substance that could cause harm to humans, people in workplaces, in hazard. This is also a physical condition that may pose risk of injury in the lower back of or nerves of a person. We have chemical hazard. I could just go on and on explaining the type of hazard, but primarily, most importantly, what we need to do is to make a response action to handle this, to curtail any of these challenges as may be posed from the environment. Let me also speak a little bit on the environment. For example, we like I earlier said, we talked about climate change, and we should look at we talked about climate change. Sorry, just a minute. We have discussed climate change also. And when we look at climate change, we need to understand what necessitated climate change. We talk about the release of carbon dioxide and so on. Environment forms what we call greenhouse effect. You understand? And in some scenarios, you have some kind of rain that is called acid rain, because the accumulation of gases in atmosphere result into an acid rain, but they are not actually, they are not pure. And these gases also accumulation in the air also leads to the depletion of the ozone layer. The ozone layer, if the ozone layer is depleted, then it allows a direct penetration, that's the ultraviolet radiation, into the heart. You understand? That is very risky. So I think why subjects like this are very important is for a proper awareness program for people to know what and what to put in place and what to checks and balances to avoid certain things. Once again, I would like to emphasize on the role of NOSDRA as an agency, National Oil Spill Detection Response Agency. I've earlier mentioned we carry out barrel remediations, we curtail spill. You understand? We are the stakeholder, we are in charge of spill, managing oil spill in Nigeria. And you see, there are a lot of companies into exploration and all of that, and there is no how you could carry out exploration, there will not be a spill. You understand? Some of these spill some of them are as a result of equipment failure, some of them as a result of human error and all that. So we regulate, as a body, we regulate the oil companies and put checks and balances to ensure that the waterways and the landways are saved. That's the offshore, onshore. We ensure that is safe for the environment, because everything we talk about now, the hazard, the preparedness, everything boils down on environment. You understand? So our activity on the environment goes a long way. And that's why programs like this should continue to actually put people into checks. And also there are certain activities we carry out in our environment, which we should know that somehow the ozone layer is getting depleted over time. If you can see the size of the ozone layer, you will understand the risk that is ahead. I mean, the risk ahead, is, I'm referring to the risk where the ultraviolet radiation penetrates directly to the heart surface. I mean, and I'm sure nobody will be able to withstand that. But the activities around the world can still be checkmate. Some of these carbons, the hydrocarbons, the chlorofluorocarbons, the emissions can actually be reduced or be converted into something else to generate something. For example, in some of the part of the world, like Alaska, for example, you see their soil highs and they must generate heat. How do they generate heat? They use cow dung. So there is also need for the country as a whole to look out for alternative in, gas flaring, release of carbons, either carbon 2 oxide, carbon 4 oxide, chlorofluorocarbons, and all of that. We should find out that there are other ways to convert those things to gas and to other things. I would like to take a pause here, and also wait. Yes, sorry, before I forget, NOSDRA also carry out what is called facility inspection. Facility inspections to oil companies. We evaluate, or we check the equipment they have, the response equipment they have, because when there is a spill occurrence, the NOSDRA, the company, for example, will actually try in their own capacity to curtail the spill. That's the point at which we call tier 1. And when it gets to tier 2, it is an expanded scenario now, where they will need an external support, where they will need to notify the stakeholders of what is happening, seeking both internal and external support at tier 3. You understand? So there's a whole lot that NOSDRA perform as an agency. we do a whole lot that I can, because of my time, I may not be able to explain everything that NOSDRA does, but NOSDRA plays a major role in safety. That safety, for example, if there is a spill and it is not curtailed, it leads to the death of aquatic organisms, and some people somewhere are drinking that water. As long as that water is flowing from a source to another, some people are drinking that water, and the impact of that on such people is cancer of the skin, cancer of the lungs. You understand? So NOSDRA checkmate this thing to ensure that there are no occurrences of such. If there are questions for me, I'll take them.
Wow, that's highly informative. Highly informative. Thank you very much, Mr. David. You have really said a lot of things about this topic, and you have given us so many information, especially touching up on what NOSDRA does to ensure all of these things are being managed properly. Thank you very much. Right now, I want to appreciate all our contributors. We have so many questions, so many questions. I could see that the session was getting more interesting and questions kept coming in. And even though we have exceeded our time frame, we'll still be able to take like a couple of questions. I will give one question to each presenter, one question to each presenter, one question each, because we have so many questions and our time is fast spent. Okay, the first question I'm going to take will be for Mr. Ken. Mr. Ken, the question that we have here for Mr. Ken is that, in your own opinion, how will you approach environmental emergency response in Africa in order to be prepared for the unexpected? In your own opinion, how will you approach environmental emergency response in Africa in order to be prepared for the unexpected? That's for Mr. Ken. In just 1 minute, please.
No problem at all. It all comes down to the fact that we must have an emergency response system where we have a very clear organization which within the company or the organization that's got the emergency, which works well with the other stakeholders, including government bodies. And as I've said, that organization must understand the risks it has. So it has the scenarios which are likely to occur, even though, as has been said, we don't know when they'll occur. We can confidently predict most of the kind of things that will occur. And what we then need to do is ensure that we have the right competencies in place within the organization. And what I have seen, and this has come up time and again in not just Africa, in a lot of parts of the world, that people don't understand that however well trained you are in different parts of your career, that you cannot manage a crisis at the same time as getting involved in the detail of an emergency. So we need managers who can put into place an emergency response plan. They can trust the people who are managing that emergency response plan, just as an airline trusts its senior pilot to be in charge of the aircraft. The owner of the airline doesn't get involved too much. And they put those people in place. We have a competence assurance framework for assuring that everybody knows the job. We have, as David said, the maintenance of the equipment. I think David said that one. The emergency equipment is done, and I'm sure the fire service are very adept at this, maintaining the equipment in top condition, ready. But certainly from an environmental point of view, we have to ensure that safety of people comes first, but then we have a very clear handover to environment, and that we are ready for the climate change issues that are inevitably going to come. They shouldn't be a surprise. They can be predicted. We can see the trends, but it's all about good emergency response plans, clear demarcation of responsibilities, understanding that senior top management will be managing a crisis outside the organization. Therefore, they must train and trust people lower down the organization to manage that, provide them with the right resources and equipment. So I hope that answers the question. But it's all an integrated thing. You can't separate safety, environment, managing your assets, and managing your reputation. And for most companies, most businesses, the reputation is worth far more than anything else. That's all I want to say because of time.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Ken, for
I don't know whether that
response.
answers the question.
Okay, now the second question yes, I believe so. He answers the question well. Yes, sir. Okay, so now the second question we go to Mr. Emmanuel. Mr. Emmanuel, I have like a couple of questions which I can actually merge together because, you know, fire occurs in most communities, especially in Nigeria. So many rural communities, they have fire incidences and all of that. And the person would like to know, how can the public become involved in the emergency planning and the preparedness process? How can we integrate the interested personalities amongst the communities into this emergency planning and preparedness process? Over to you, Mr. Emmanuel.
Thank you so much, Diola. Now, to get communities involved in the emergency preparedness plan is very easy. First is that it's expected that every household, for instance, should be able to have basic firefighting equipment in place. What are the basic firefighting equipment in place they need to have? For a domestic or a residential building, for instance, you need to have a smoke detectors installed. You need to have fire extinguishers installed. You also need to have something like a fire blanket for the kitchen. Now, it is not enough to have these devices put in place. You also need to know what to do in the first place for those fires not to occur. And even that they occur, of course, if every fire starts small, unless and except in the case of an explosion, you know, you'll be able to, you should have a requisite knowledge to know what to do when the fire starts. If the fire is still within a manageable size that you could use a fire extinguisher, then you are trained on how to make use of fire extinguisher to put out the fire. So the involvement of communities and personalities in emergency response plan is always very, very important to us because every emergency is local. So we always target every group of people, whether in an office setting or in an organization and in a community arrangement, where we begin to educate them. Of course, emergency response is expensive, we know that, but there are actions and steps we need to take to avoid emergencies from occurring. So we are very much, you know, interested in making sure that these communities have the basic knowledge of what to do to prevent fire from occurring in the first place. And if they do occur, what to do to, you know, mitigate its impact, curtailing its spreading. So we involve them in education, fire safety education, and sensitization. Like we do go to correctional facilities, for instance, where inmates are put through a rudimentary training on what to do when there is fire outbreak. It will amaze you that something as little as, you know, how to avoid the smoke inhalation when there's fire outbreak is very, very key to surviving a fire disaster. You know, usually it is smoke inhalation that kills people first before they get burned. You know, that's part of the phase of the incident is very, very critical. And that is why if you do not train people, if you do not impart the right knowledge to the communities, you are going to have serious casualties, or you're going to suffer a lot of casualties when there's an emergency. We have seen it several times at several incidences where there's a petrol tanker will fail, and you see communities around that incident rushing to go and scoop petroleum product, and in the process that results to fire, and we suffer a lot of casualties. So those enlightenment and sensitization to tell people that, look, irrespective of the level of poverty, we do not need to, endanger our life by engaging in this kind of practices. That it's important that when these kind of incidences occur, we keep away from that scene because of the potential hazard, a potential explosion that will occur and then probably kill everybody. So we engage communities through our public awareness campaigns, through trainings. We engage corporate organizations through evacuation plan drills, fire extinguishing techniques, basic firefighting techniques. We engage them and train their staff on that. There are a lot of organizations we carry out regular evacuation drills from time to time. That is all in a bid to make sure that they build that awareness capacity to be able to respond to or react to any emergency. Of course, when there's an emergency, one of the things that lead to injuries or death are usually panic. So, but when you have sufficient knowledge, you will be able to eliminate that panic and then be able to take the right decisions and then save yourself from being harmed. We also have schools. We have school outreach programs we carry out to reach out to schools, especially at the primary level. We enlighten the children. A lot of people in Nigeria don't even know the numbers to call when there's fire outbreak. With our school outreach program, we are educating the kids. You are amazed that as a parent, you may not even know the number to call when there's fire outbreak, but your child knows, because when they call for excursion, these are some of the things we train them on. They'll be able to pick this information, and when they get back home, they relate it to their parents. So education is one of those methods through which we involve communities and personalities to be part of an emergency response plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that response, Mr. Emmanuel. Okay, so I have the other time I did mention Nozria, who joined as a team, and one of them has actually spoken. So the question I'll be asking, I would allow Mr. Franklin to attend to that question, and we can take contribution also from Awele. So the question for Nozria is, what are the key mechanisms or channels for reporting or documentation of equipment failures? Earlier you emphasized on equipment failures that leads to hazards and all of that. So Mr. Timothy would like to know the key mechanism or channels for reporting or documentation of equipment failure or related issues. That is, of course, before the hazard occurs. Especially on pipelines and the likes. Mr. Francis, over to you, please. I've sent you a notification to unmute, so you can accept that and attend to the question. Okay, Mr. David, please contact him, let him accept the notification and speak, or you can take the question as well, so that we can proceed.
Hello.
Yes, I am with you.
I think Mr. Franklin is online. So, Mr. Franklin. Hello. Okay, let me just take the question. Please, what's the question again?
Okay, the question goes thus. What are the key mechanisms or channels for reporting or documentation of equipment failures or related issues? Earlier you talked about equipment failures and all of that, and we know you manage pipelines and the likes. So the person would like to know the mechanism or channels for reporting or documentation of equipment failures or related issues.
Okay. NOSDRA has a team who carries out drill activation, especially from the technical department, from asset safety and mitigations, and it's actually called a drill activation exercise. While NOSDRA is visiting the organization, NOSDRA is checking through those things, checking through what is in place. And actually, there is a NOSDRA form in which the organization is supposed to fill. There's forms A, there's form B, and form C. And in all of those forms, it tries to balance up NOSDRA's regulations and to ensure that the company is operating in line with NOSDRA's guidelines. Before now, I think a lot of companies they were kind of confused reporting to their reports are going to another organization in which I would not like to mention, but I think that aspect is being corrected. So the reporting line for equipment failure is actually to contact the personnel. I mean, the personnel, that's the top management staff of NOSDRA, which is the Director General, Mr. Musa. We also the Director Asset Safety and Mitigation, Mr. Banewa. Also contact the Director of Oilfield Assets, Mr. Akindele. These persons they're actually in charge to respond to whatever difficulty you're going through. Please, let me quickly say that Mr. Frank is also there waiting for your permission. He's ready to put more, shed more light on this particular question. Thank you. Hello.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I can see him raising his hand.
Yes.
Yes, okay, Mr. Frank, please, you can respond to that question as well. I've sent you a notification to unmute. Please go ahead and speak. Okay, there's no audio. Yes, you can drop in your contribution as a text, please. I'm sorry, I will not be able to wait any further because we can't hear you. You can drop in your contribution as a text. We really appreciate your active participation in this session. Do drop your contribution as a text, or you can send to info@richflood.com. We would have access to all the information that you might want to share with us regarding this topic. It has been quite an enlightening session this afternoon. I want to appreciate everyone, all the participants, all our speakers, the team from the Federal Fire Service represented by Mr. Inya Emmanuel. Thank you very much for your participation and for your contribution. Mr. Ken Heap, all the way from the UK, thank you very much for your participation and for your contribution. He has dropped some other contribution in form of text, and we have all of them. We'll relate them to the appropriate person you have asked me to send it to. Thank you so much for your participation. And the team from NOSDRA, thank you very much for your participation and for your contribution. It has been quite an informative session here today. We appreciate every one of us, and we would like to say a very big thank you from behalf of Richflood. We want to say thank you to everyone for attending and even for staying up till this present moment, because usually we take 1 hour, but I saw the trend that the discussion was going, and it will be unfair if we don't allow people who are really prepared, if we don't allow them to speak their mind. So thank you very much for your patience. I would like to use this opportunity to inform you that this kind of workshop is being hosted on a monthly basis. So our next workshop is going to be on Resettlement Action Plan. Resettlement Action Plan, that is RAP. which entails the planning, the implementation, and the monitoring. And we are going to be having key players in the industries who will be enlightening us also on this particular topic. And the date for that is on the 19th of August. 19th of August. To register for that, we'll drop the link, the registration link on the chat box. It is also a free workshop and free to register and attend the event. Before we finally draw the curtain of today's workshop, can we all switch on our video for a group photograph? We have all been here, our videos have been off, our voices have been muted. We would like to have a group photograph. So please, the technical team, send a notification to everyone on the list to put on their video right now. Start sending notifications to put on their video. So you can start your video, you receive a notification, just accept it while our digital personnel will take the shots. Please put on your video. Let's see you, let's meet you. If you're in the office, call your colleagues to come around. Let me stop sharing my screen so that we can see everyone boldly. Let me stop sharing my screen so that we can see everyone boldly. Oh, wow, wow. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your participation. Please put on your video, put on your video. You're all looking radiant and nice. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, thank you. Yes, yes, I can see that. You look really good. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. Madam Rita, thank you. Thank you very much. Much for joining us. Wow, I can see the beautiful faces and the handsome faces. Thank you very much for your participation in today's event. Please, the technical team, take the shots as we have our participants' faces displayed on their screen right now. If you are yet to do so, please put on your video. Mr. Olujide Ogundare, put on your video. Okay. Yes, Adedayo Opeyemi. Yes, everyone, if you are yet to do so, please put on your video. Put on your video. Barrister Jude, thank you for joining us. We can see you. Mr. Adeolu Toye, thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Apiribo, Madam Clarence, Mr. Charles Daniels, Mr. Martins, Redmi, I think Mr. Franklin, Awele Osas from Nojra, thank you very much for joining us. Aruna
Recording in
Idayat.
progress.
Aruna Idayat.
Recording in progress.
Aruna Idayat.
Recording in progress. Recording in progress.
Okay, I was off for a little while. Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, Mr. Max, you are looking so sharp. Mr. Albert Chinedu, thank you very much for joining us. Yes, yes, thank you very much. Oh, Madam Hawele Osaz, you're actually a woman. You look so beautiful. Thank you very much. Thanks for your active participation and your contribution. Okay, Mr. Martins, thank you. Mr. Charles Daniels, thank you. Thank you. Kabiru Idayat, Gladwin Investments. Thank you very much for joining us. Okay, we have Madam Fumi Juliet. Thank you, everyone. I may not be able to mention your name. Please pardon me if I didn't mention your name, but we really appreciate you. And we have taken all the necessary shots. We hope to see you next month. We hope that you join us again next month, and we'll have another great session because it's been a wonderful time with everyone right here. So right now, I would like to draw the curtain. And once again, from Richflood, I want to say thank you. And we hope to see you next month. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye. Bye, everyone.